Good morning, everyone. Today is a bit unusual. On the 29th of June, throughout the Universal Church, we celebrate the Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, no matter on what day it falls. It just so happened that we're privileged to have this very, very special solemnity fall on a Sunday this year. It's an opportunity for the whole church to consider these two great pillars, St. Peter and St. Paul. You may not know that in Rome on this day, the Holy Father has a special Mass, an outdoor Mass in honor of Saints Peter and Paul, and at this Mass, he bestows the pallium on all of the metropolitan archbishops that have been named throughout the world during this past year. The pallium is like we may see it on some archbishops during a ceremony. It's like a stole in a little bit. It's made of 100% lamb's wool, and it goes around his neck, and a little piece comes down the front and the back. It's a reminder to those archbishops throughout the world that they are shepherds, and they carry their flock on their shoulders. It's also a reminder that they have a special union with the shepherd, the successor of St. Peter. Peter, who heard the words of our Lord in today's gospel, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, one particular feast day of Saints Peter and Paul, when I was in Rome, I attended this outdoor Mass. And the day started beautifully, just like today. But guess what happened? The clouds came, and it began to rain. Rain and rain and rain. Now you have to remember, these archbishops, many of them had just purchased new white albs, and they had these beautiful red vestments on, matching red vestments that had a nice red dye in it. Well, as it began to rain, guess what happened? These poor archbishops became soaked, and the red dye soaked into their beautiful white albs, and it was all over them. They were literally and unfortunately covered in red. I think that was rather providential. I didn't tell them that, of course, but I think it was rather providential because when you consider it, Peter and Paul gave their life for Christ. The red is a symbol of that blood, and that shepherds have to be ready to lay down their life for their sheep. Indeed, these two great saints that we celebrate today, Peter and Paul, did that. They were very different men, just like all of us. We're very, very different, yet Christ called them. Peter was a simple man, a fisherman from Galilee. And yet, Christ saw in him the leader of his church. As we heard, as I said in today's gospel, Jesus changes his name, just like God changed the name of Abram to Abraham, just like he changed the name of Jacob to Israel. So the God-man comes and chooses the very rock of his church and says, "You are no longer Simon, but Petrus," a name meaning rock, chosen to be the vicar of Christ, given by Christ this ministry of unity that's passed on to his successor all the way down to our present Pope, Pope Francis. But then we have Paul, a man who was born outside of Israel, a Jew nonetheless. But unlike Peter, he was a very well-educated man, a cultured man, a tent maker, who studied in Jerusalem one of the most famous professors in Judaism at the time, Gamaliel. He was, unlike Peter, chosen to be the apostle to the Gentiles, a great writer who was responsible for most of the New Testament when you think about it. But despite the fact that these two men were so different in their background, they had two things in common. They were both called by Christ to follow him, and both followed him unto death. In the year 64 AD, Peter was arrested, crucified upside down and buried on the Vatican Hill. Paul, a few years later, in 67 AD, was beheaded outside of Rome along the Via Ostiense and is buried nearby. Different men, yes, but the same love for Christ, a love that is willing to give of oneself. I think if there is one phrase in all the readings of today that summarizes the life of both Peter and Paul, it comes from our second reading. Paul's second letter to Timothy, he says this: I, Paul, am already being poured out like a libation. I have competed well. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Yes, my brothers and sisters, these two great pillars that we remember today were poured out like a libation. A libation is a drink of wine, for instance, that's poured out on an altar to honor God. And so both their lives were poured out in the blood, the red blood of martyrdom. But what do their lives have to do with us? Are Peter and Paul simply historic figures that we remember nicely and think, aren't their lives wonderful? They're more than that. They're saints, which means they can tell us something about how we can be saints. In a very real way, we need to remember that our lives needs to be a pouring out, a libation for God. Whether that comes in the form of a bloody martyrdom or an unbloody one, our lives must follow the example of Peter and Paul. How? Well, look at our daily duties. Look at what you and I do every day. Whether it's caring for children or grandchildren, whether it is patience with that coworker who drives us crazy every once in a while, whether it's simply those jobs around the house that we have to complete, our involvement in our local community, there is a certain martyrdom of charity every day. Living our faith, too, is another opportunity for us to pour out our lives like a libation for Christ. You know, our world is becoming more hostile toward Christians, particularly Catholics. In order to remain faithful to a daily prayer life, including saying prayers in public at meals, making Sunday Mass a priority every week, lovingly obeying the divine law, especially in those areas that are so countercultural, like the sacredness of human life, and that each marital act must be open to life. These are not always easy things to live. Living our faith is hard. But remember the example of Peter and Paul, who were willing to give of their very life to follow him. And finally, my brothers and sisters, we saw recently just how many people in our world are living in poverty. The Morning Call recently had an article saying that 87% of people in the school district of Allentown are at poverty level or below. 87%. Our neighbors, our friends, our family members are in need of us pouring out our lives in the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. There are many in our neighborhoods, right here in Allentown, who lack both the material and spiritual needs that they long for and definitely need. My brothers and sisters, the world doesn't center on me. So why should I center my own attention on me? Pour out our lives like a libation, as Peter and Paul did, in those acts of corporal and spiritual works of mercy. In this way, we follow the example of these two great pillars and follow them to heaven. And so, on this feast of Peter and Paul, I think it's good for all of us to remember those archbishops, those poor archbishops covered in the red of their vestments. remember that that is a symbol for us, that we too must be covered in the blood of our own self-giving love for others. Peter and Paul are separated from us by over 20 centuries, but our love for Christ unites us. Our faith held in common unites us. We, like them, ought to answer the call of the Lord to be poured out like a libation, and that we can say, as Paul did at the end of our lives, I have competed well, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith.